Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the channel. I am your host, Baron Imperius, and for today's construction project we will be building a simple house inspired by my previous terrain builds for Curse of Strahd. The overall design is a rather generic medieval European inspiration common to fantasy settings like in Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and other popular tabletop RPGs. As an example, here is the first building I completed for that specific Curse of Strahd campaign. I took only loose inspiration from the module's actual description. Overall, I am very happy with this build and the lessons it taught me. So for this project, I am aiming to mimic the grim, rustic appearance of Blinsky's Toys, something that would blend into most fantasy settings. First things first. This project will be built from sheet foam I purchased from the dollar store. Now, the foam has this protective paper on both sides that can be peeled off. I don't always peel it away for my projects, but if it gets in the way or you're concerned about it peeling later, go ahead and remove it for your own projects. For the scale of my builds, 1 inch equals 5 feet, which is pretty standard for D&D and other tabletop games. This scale also looks pretty good alongside both 28 and 32 millimeter miniatures. For the roof, I went with an open gable with 2 angles to give it a bit of a dip and a splash of personality. Giving your projects these little quirks will help them stand out from each other, especially if you plan on having a lot to choose from. Once the walls are all cut out, you can begin to measure out where you want your major structural elements, like chimneys, doors, and windows. As you can see, at this point I have also removed the protective paper sheet from the foam, but only for the exterior portions. I prefer to keep the paper on for the interior. I cut out the squares for the windows, deciding on only 2, one on the front left of the doorway and one on the right. For my standard windows, I tend to make them about 3/4 of an inch tall and at their widest about 1 inch. Once the windows are done, I begin working on attaching the walls. First, I cut some toothpicks into dowels with a sharp point at one end. Then I join the corners of the 2 walls together, using plenty of glue or Mod Podge where the 2 meet. Then I use a sharp needle to puncture a hole through the 2 walls, and drive a dowel through. I like to use at least 2 dowels to secure a corner, one near the top, one near the bottom, but more will be necessary for taller builds, of course. Wipe any excess glue on the exterior, but put globs along the joint of the interior to make sure the walls are nice and secure. Next, I'm going to be putting in the chimney on the back wall. I cut a strip of foam to the desired height, just a little shorter than the top of the roof. I then glue the strip for the chimney to the back of the wall. While the glue sets, I cut another foam strip that will serve as the stone foundation for the house. After I cut it to the appropriate height and length, I carefully cut the strip's thickness in half. This way the foundation is thicker than the rest of the wall, giving it the appearance of a sturdy base, but also lets the chimney stand out from the overall structure. Now I texture the foundation by either rolling a crumpled ball of foil on the foam or using a rock to leave an imprint. Both methods can give it a stone-like appearance. Then I use a pencil to draw in the brick pattern. Then I retrace it with a fine point Sharpie. The ink of the Sharpie seems to break down the styrofoam's spongy structure just enough to help with the imprint's legibility. I also cut little divots along the top of the foundation between the stones. That way the foundation's outline is not as smooth or straight and looks a little bit more realistic. Finally, I glue the foundation to the base of the wall, applying pressure for a decent amount of time to make sure that it sets nice and flush against the wall. For the chimney, I use tiny foam bricks that I have already cut and textured. They sort of look like a tub of Good 'n' Plenty's. Most are too thick and have to be cut in half, and some even further cut in order to fit in place. This method results in a much more random pattern with more dramatic texture, but is much more time consuming. With the results of both methods being side by side, I think this tells a story that clearly 2 different stonemasons had to work on this house, one obviously tidier than the other. With the chimney's bricks all attached, I now glue on the crown cap and further secure it in place with another toothpick dowel. I next cut a length of plastic straw to serve as part of the flue, using a lot of glue. While that dries, I'll move on to the next step. Next, I create some steps leading to the doorway. The base of the steps is designed to look like large stone slates rather than bricks. It is attached to the wall with plenty of glue and more toothpick dowels. With the base of the steps in place, I glue on a second smaller set of slates to serve as the next flight of stairs up to the doorway. At some point I realized that the back of the foundation was too tall, but instead of trying to fix it, I simply made the other sides the appropriate height. This detail will just have to become one of those happy little accidents that gives the house some personality. For the door, I cut out a rectangle of cardstock, and then use a combination of pencil and needle to give it a texture like it's made from wooden slats. I use the pencil to make the lines that make it look like it's made of multiple slats of wood put together, while the needle I can use to put in a wood grain into the paper. Now I take some popsicle sticks and cut them to size for the wooden beams at the corners of the house. While I do have wooden coffee stir sticks among my supplies, I started my crafting journey primarily with using the popsicle sticks. This takes a little longer and more effort, but they have a decent thickness in comparison to stir sticks and can be cut into wider slats as needed. Once cut to the appropriate dimensions, sanding as necessary with an emery board or some sandpaper, they are glued on. In a similar manner, I create the frames for the windows. The frame that is within the wall, I make sure that the fit is very snug and has plenty of glue. I also add a length of toothpick to the dead center of the frame as a way of suggesting that the window has multiple panes of glass without actually having to go through the process of making that. Once I finish with the front window, I proceed to do the same with the window on the right wall. With the window frames finished, we can now add a frame around the doorway. I always like to make the lintel look nice and big. Now we can add more wooden slats to serve as structural supports for the house. This time I'll use coffee stir sticks in order to save time and effort. I like to follow patterns seen in surviving historical examples. Some diagonal supports, especially for the roof, can help break out the grid-like monotony of the supports. With all those wooden supports for the walls finished, we can move on to adding supports for the roof. Unlike the supports for the walls, which are purely cosmetic, these will actually serve a purpose in that they will support the roof and the shingles that will be attached. Next, we add the rake for the roof on the right and left sides of the house. I think rake is the correct term, though I'm not sure, and I'm certain someone in the comments will probably correct me if I'm wrong. I also allow there to be some overhang, in this case about ½ an inch. I will also add additional supports to the bottom of the roof that will also hang over the wall. With the roof supports completed, I go ahead and begin to prime the wood and plaster portions of the house, essentially everything above the foundations. The paint I'm using is an acrylic, and it is a dark brown shade called burnt umber. I have to do this before adding the shingles or the glass for the windows. Before I get too far with that though, I need to add some details to the door, such as the iron supports, which will be easy enough to repaint later. After I glue down the strips, I puncture it to look like nails or rivets, holding the iron bands to the wood slats. With that done, I can move on to priming the rest of the house. Once the house is primed with a few layers of dark umber, I can begin dry brushing with lighter shades of brown. For the first layer, I'm going to use a golden tan called honeycomb. I'm going to be very generous with my application of this layer, but also trying not to cover up too much of the dark umber. The next layer is a much lighter tan, almost a beige, called linen. With this layer, I have to be a little bit more careful so as not to cover up too much of the previous two layers. With the dry brushing for the wooden portions finished for now, I move on to the stone. To start off with, I very carefully go in and paint black wherever the foundation is touching the plaster or the wood on the rest of the house. Once the delicate part is done, the rest of the stone is primed in black. Once all the stone is primed, the dry brushing can begin. I start with a layer of medium gray, but carefully dry brush so as not to get too much gray onto the wooden portions. Next layer is pale gray. Again, I am being very careful not to get gray on the wooden portions, but also not to completely overpower the previous layers of medium gray and the black underneath. With the stone finished for now, comes painting the plastered portions of the wall. I decided to try to match the color scheme from Blinsky's toys, so I'm going to use the linen shade for the plaster. For this portion, I think using a thick paint is fine, since it can leave a nice texture on the foam. Now with the stone, wood, and plaster finished, I will dry brush the entire house with an off-white shade called Vintage White, which has a slight yellowish tint to it. So I give it a light brushing all over, at the same time being careful not to overdo it. And now, a word from our sponsors.
This episode is sponsored by Imperios. It's food, so you can eat it. Do it today. 9 out of 10 street urchins say it's better than gruel.
This is not a real product.
Now, back to the show. For the next portion, I get a little foam bead and a piece of the cardstock to create the lock and doorknob for the entrance. Once I'm able to cut it into the desired shape, once that's all squared away, I paint the supports, lock, and doorknob a nice metallic shade of gunmetal gray, which I think has a very good iron look to it. I also decided to add a little address placard next to the door, cutting and sanding a piece of popsicle stick into the desired shape. After painting it gunmetal gray, I add some numbers in black and glue it in place. Finally, I can move on to finishing the roof. Due to the way the roof is shaped, I'll need at least 4 panels, 2 on each side. I cut the black cardstock and glue them in place to the wooden supports of the roof. Before I get much farther with the roof, I need to glue the glass for the windows in place. Typically, I use the clear plastic packaging from things like WizKids Minis. From the flat portion of the packaging, I cut a square of the plastic that is more than large enough to cover the window. I then add a layer of glossy Mod Podge that will give the window some texture. Once that dries, I add a thick layer of glue around the window frame on the interior of the house. I then carefully put the glass in place and let that set. Now for my favorite part, shingles.
Doesn't care.
What was that? Anyways, I cut the black cardstock into strips about 3/8 to a half an inch thick. Once I have enough strips to get started, I cut teeth along one side, more than about halfway deep, and at intervals of roughly 3/16 of an inch. In an effort to save time, I often double up the strips, cutting through 2 or 3 at a time. Once all of the strips have teeth, I go through and fold up every other tooth. Then I can give each little folded up tooth a little snip to shorten it. When it comes to shingles, I don't try for perfection because the time and tedium would certainly drive me completely insane. Once you've finished enough strips of shingles, you can glue down a strip at intervals of roughly 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch, working from the bottom up. After you glue down each strip, you also need to take 2 rough squares, fold them in half, and then glue them onto the corners so that it overlaps with the strip you just glued down and the wooden rake of the roof. This process should result in rows of shingles that are a little random but orderly enough. Once you get to the top, you add more of the rough half-folded squares from the outer corners of the roof's ridge going into the center, making sure that they overlap just a little bit. After all the shingles are on and the glue is dry, the hardest part, in my opinion, is finally over. I can now dry brush. I start with navy blue to give a little color to the house, followed by a layer of medium gray, and finally a layer of pale gray, followed by a very light brushing of titanium white. For a final touch, I make a cone from the cardstock and attach it with 4 little strips to the chimney flue to create the chimney cover. Once the glue dries, I paint it in gunmetal gray, and finally dry brush with a little cardinal red, followed by pumpkin orange to add a hint of rust and weathering. Now I apply my dirty wash, essentially a very watered down mix of black and burnt umber with a drop or 2 of dish soap. The wash will sink into all of the crevices to help bring out texture, mute some of the brighter tones, and give the illusion of age, weathering, and shadows. When applying it, I have to move quickly and make sure that the coverage is even and not pooling in too many places. Once the wash is dry, I can take the house outside and give it a good spray with acrylic sealer, in this case, matte Mod Podge. It isn't perfectly matte, but I've gotten used to it by now. Once the sealant dries, time to have a look at the final product. Overall, I'm very happy with this build. I think it looks great alongside the Blinsky's toys and my other Barovia builds. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe even feel inspired to build your own little projects. If so, please like the video and maybe leave a comment down below. And if you're interested in any future videos, please subscribe. I know some of you may have watched my previous video and were hoping to see the part 2 for my old bone grinder project. I promise, it is coming down the pipeline. There's just a lot of content to get through, and I'm still figuring out how to be more efficient with my editing. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to build your fantasy.